thanks very much, everybody. Thank you for joining me for this, I guess it's a convening conversation to talk a little bit about sort of where innovation has been and how it might change now in the post-COVID era. I appreciate the Ashoka folks inviting me to do this. It's sort of inspired a little bit by this report about the innovation imperative that I and some colleagues of mine at the Chronicle worked on over the past year. One of the things that's been really striking to me about all this is this whole movement about innovation and disruptive innovation that a lot of people have heard about. It actually really all started in higher ed, I think, after the last recession, the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. And so I think it's kind of interesting to find ourselves back at that spot here now where we're facing, well, we don't know what the depth of this thing is going to be, but it's certainly not pretty. And we know it's going to be very devastating to our economy. And so I think it's sort of interesting to be thinking a little bit now about what this new recession will, maybe depression even, will do to our economy and what it's going to mean for higher education. One of the things that always struck me about the last round where there was such a demand for innovation, such a demand for disruption, is like a lot of the people that were making those arguments for that were people who were sort of overlooking the fact that higher ed had really been changing quite a lot during that same period that they were complaining about higher ed never changing. I mean, for every pundit who gets up there and says, you know, we are still standing in a classroom teaching the way we used to teach before, I mean, they haven't obviously been in a higher ed campus in a long time. They don't appreciate that how extensively, not as extensive as I should be, but how extensively open educational resources are being used, how much of advising right now is being done with data-driven systems, how much classroom work is being done with project-based learning and like guided pathways. There's a whole range of innovations, very little of them having to do with technology, but then let's add the fact that, you know, giant online educational institutions, you know, enroll millions of students at this point. And all that's been happening during this period where supposedly higher ed has not been innovating at all. So I think it's pretty interesting to take some step back and take some context on that. All that said, higher ed is not the easiest place to innovate for a lot of reasons. Some of them are about language. I mean, the jargon around innovation, especially the way higher innovation has been sort of portrayed in the last 6 or 7 years, 8 years, it's been around disruption, and the language has been the kind of language that's been very, I think, threatening for good reasons in some ways to faculty and to people on campuses, because often the word innovation signals do more with less. And when it's come after a period where there's been a lot of asking people to do more with less, it's not a very welcome phrase. I even know some people, Karen Stout, the head of Achieving the Dream, told me in this report that they don't even use that word innovation anymore because it just scares people and turns people off. They try to find another language because that language is just so dangerous. And it doesn't need to be. You could achieve the same things without, you know, just throwing innovation at everybody. We're as guilty of it as anybody else, but it's an interesting thought to me about how much the jargon gets in the way. I think the other thing that really gets in the way of innovation is the way it was initially tied up so much with IT and ed tech and maybe even the MOOCs for a little period of time there, because innovation, some of the most incredibly important innovations in higher ed, are not necessarily tied to technology at all. They're certainly, I mean, at this point, technologies are like electricity. It's like everywhere, and certainly we know that now more than ever. But I think it's all been sort of tied up in the ed tech boom, and you know, it's not innovation unless there's some app that goes with it, and obviously that's kind of silly right now. But I think that holdover from that period has kind of made it much harder for colleges and people who care about making change to get that change done. And finally, this is a point I made to some of you who were maybe in the earlier session today. I think a lot of the focus around innovation has been, oh, let's go innovating. We're going to go innovating today. And you know, innovation for the sake of innovation is just, frankly, it's stupid. You should be making changes, and you should be thinking about different approaches because you're trying to accomplish something different. You're trying to, you know, improve your graduation rate. You're trying to create a better social safety net for lower income students. Maybe you're trying to improve the employability of your graduates. Those are all reasons to innovate. innovation to, just to be a place that changes stuff around is just kind of, chasing your tail. But I think the way that argument has gotten spun over time has been damaging to the sincere efforts of a lot of people to do innovation in a way that matters. One thing that's been interesting to me is also the culture of higher education. I mean, it's not really designed for change, and that's a deliberate piece of the culture. It's, these are institutions that have stood hundreds of years, obviously, and so the culture isn't really meant for it. But if you can develop changes to the culture, you can really do a lot. And part of that goes back to mission, and part of that goes back to communicating why you're making these changes. It goes back to the reason for the innovation to begin with. And like, one of the people I spoke to when I did this innovation report was a younger administrator at Lehman College at CUNY, and he was talking a little bit about one of the ways CUNY really raised their graduation rates was they just made a real emphasis on it. And they used to have these people at the school, they would call them graduation auditors. And then they changed their titles to graduation specialists. Their job wasn't that different, but suddenly their job was to make sure students graduated as opposed to seeing why students weren't graduating. And that's just that's one of those cases where that's not maybe someone might call that jargon, but I feel like that's changing intentionality about what you're doing, using language to signal a culture change and make a real difference. Which gets me back to this whole point about communications. It was important in February, it's important in January, it's incredibly important right now. Being able to communicate what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you're doing it is frankly, it's never been more important. Because now more than ever, colleges are going to have to be communicating an incredible amount of change. I just read this, my colleague Beth McMurtry just 5 minutes ago, we posted a really interesting story on the Chronicle homepage about schools that are looking to sort of change the calendar. I'd written about the calendar as a interesting focus of innovation a few years ago, and obviously with the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of schools are trying to rethink the calendar for the fall. And it's interesting to me, number one, that's an innovation that obviously has got very little to do with technology and everything to do with sort of, culture and mindset and structure. But there's a quote at the end of that story where it's just like, change is just what everyone's used to right now. It's not the exact quote, but read to the end and you'll get there. And it's just, that's where we are right now. Everything is changing fast, by the minute. Everyone's sort of getting accustomed to that. So the key is to be communicating throughout the whole time. And the reason institutions are going to have to be changing whatever imperative there was for change and for innovation before, it's going to be tenfold now. People are going to be a lot poorer than they were before. The demographic cliff that was threatening higher education before is not going away. It's still there. States are not going to have money. Institutions are not going to have money. Students are not going to have money. And so I think the challenges that who have coming our way are incredible. And one thing I was hoping to do with this session is think a little bit about kind of what that might look like. I'm happy to sort of take questions from you all about what I'm seeing what I have been seeing, how that might change along the way. But one thing I thought that might be maybe more fun, I guess a lot of you have been familiar with this news series that the New York Times editorial page has been doing called The America We Need. And it's sort of reflective of the fact that I think the COVID-19 crisis has pointed out giant gaps in our healthcare system, giant gaps in our unemployment system, giant gaps in our sort of our social safety net, more broadly in our political system. So it's gotten me thinking, my colleagues and I have been thinking a little bit about the higher ed we need. And I guess I would love to do a little crowdsourcing here with you all and use it for I write that weekly newsletter, The Edge, which is about innovation in and around higher ed. And I generally do that by getting out on the road and talking to people. I've now gone from my back bedroom to my dining room to get on the road to talk to all of you. And I was hoping maybe I could start to solicit some of your ideas about, be happy to take some questions and talk about some of the things that are going on right now. But I'd also love it maybe if we could all use the chat. I think the simplest way to do this is put it in the chat bar on the right there. Go to the bottom of your screen and you can see the chat button. You can see the chat window and put some things in there. Put some suggestions in there about what is the higher ed we need now. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about how we get there, and just sort of take it from there. I think this is a relatively short session. Oh, good. There's the questions posted. What's the higher ed we read right now? And, you know, my hat tip to the New York Times for this framing, because I think it's a useful one. Because it's not like there's a blank slate, and there's not a blank slate, and there's certainly, you know, on April 16th, many more constraints on colleges than there were when we first decided to have this session. So this is a harder exercise than it used to be, but I think it's an important one. And, you know, hopefully not every version of of the higher ed we need right now is one that has dollar signs attached to it. So that's useful. All right, so stuff is starting to pop in here. Using technology to build re-engineered infrastructure to be more efficient, more accessible, more affordable and practical. I guess one thing is I'm wondering, and if people want to maybe keep these ideas coming, but I want maybe people can chime in a little bit. As I'm thinking about affordable and practical, does something get lost in that process, and how do we preserve what shouldn't get lost in that process? You know, I never got, someone just posted something about further extension of colonialism, and I have to admit it wasn't a concept I understood until I spent a few days back in February at the Fort Lewis College in Colorado, which serves a lot of Native American students. And that was, you know, fascinating for me to hear the discussion in that context there, because that suddenly became a lot clearer to me in ways. All right, oh, there's a lot of good ideas here. Higher, we're still creating perhaps a more interdisciplinary approach in our graduates. I'm definitely thinking interdisciplinary is an issue out there. I wonder if people feel like it's not that, what holds us back from being interdisciplinary now? If you want to speak, there is still the raise your hand function. I guess why don't we're doing this a little bit on the fly, folks, I apologize. Put your raise your hand function in there if you want, and if you want to speak. I'm kind of interested to hear what people have to say about that, what's keeping institutions from being more interdisciplinary right now. More applied learning, more problem solving, more dialogue, dumping on the students. I'm also wondering, the people who talk about more problem solving, there's been a few comments like that. This came up a little bit in the previous session. I'm wondering, in the current environment, well, not the current environment, the environment we're going to be in the fall, where I think we're not going to have very many students back on campus. What does that start to look like? How can, and maybe students are not as able to go, you know, into the community and do internships in the way that they might have want to as well. What does that look like in, you know, in October 2020? How might we be doing more problem solving in a way that makes sense?
Goldie, people may or may not know how to use the raise their hand function. Would you be comfortable if people had something to say, they could just go off mute and speak into it?
Yeah. I mean, take yourself, I think at this point, I wanted to get some input on this thing. I didn't have a plan. We didn't have a great plan. We weren't sure how many people were going to come, so we weren't sure about how to organize this part. So yeah, if you have something to say based on what you're reading in the comments here, or some question that you want to pose to me or back to the group, take yourself off mute, and we'll see what we have to hear here. Just remember, there's a lot of other people in the group, and we don't want to. I don't want to keep talking the whole time, but we want to make sure everyone gets a chance to say on here. Average.
And for anyone who speaks, if you could just say your name and institution.
Yeah. Oh, and everyone likes to type. Nobody wants to speak. If we were sitting there having our drinks, folks, we'd be talking right now. So
I'll chime in, Goldie. What are some of the? I'm Ann Evans. I'm Ann Evans, and I'm from Ashoka.
Okay.
I'm interested in what are some of the bright spots you're seeing of universities that are trying different approaches that are providing value to students in ways that make this trade-off well of affordability and quality.
I think
Quality
the
of
place,
experience. Yeah.
This is not the common example, but I think the work colleges idea, that like the Paul Quinn College, Paul Quinn University of the world, those kind of places are pretty fascinating because they're like literally putting the education and the work right there as part of the same model. And they've sort of adapted the work college model so that students can take jobs off campus and have them sort of, they're not all working on the campus. They're doing jobs in the community that are helping them build their community, their employability skills, their community building skills, and they're also getting credit for some, getting paid for some of that. And it's sort of supervised. That's sort of the most extreme version of that. I think places that are, other kinds of places that are experimenting with internships, I did a couple of, I've been very interested in this whole notion of the micro internship model. I came across there's a bunch of, in this case, outside companies that have been working closely with colleges to help sort of crowdsource internships, mini internships instead of a whole semester. Maybe it's a 2-week project that you work on as part of a class, or maybe either part of a class or unrelated to your class. You do it online. It's a great, it's a chance for you to make money, have a professional experience, and to get yourself exposed, get you some exposure to a company and give a company some exposure to you. It was always described to me as kind of a low risk way for a company to start to evaluate talent. One of the things I love about that model is it's also organized around institutions that are not just the elite places. Like a lot of fancy companies tend to only recruit at certain colleges. And this is a way for students at all kinds of different colleges to get access to sort of, interesting internship opportunities and still sort of, it breaks the mold. It doesn't just keep things for the sort of the elite students, and I feel like that actually doesn't cost very much. That doesn't cost the school any money really to do that. A little money, maybe like a little organizational time to get involved with the program, but the opportunities are there. The students actually make a little cash. They get an experience. So I think I think some of those kind of work while you learn models are pretty interesting.
Goldie, this is David Lord. I'm a trustee, so I bring but a couple of thoughts that I see as we move forward. Again,
David, where are you a trustee?
Collins in Orlando, which is a smaller liberal arts institution.
I worked at the Orlando Sentinel for 8 years, so I know the territory.
One of the things that I see as a plus, I'm seeing an incredible personalized effort going on. I think you had somewhere today, somebody commented the need to spend time with students and help bring them along. And I'm just seeing whether it's faculty and advising, whether it's administrators, people really reaching out and having one-on-one conversations. The president, having open forums where he's inviting parents to come in and have conversations. So one thing I'm finding on this is I think people are more concerned about faculty and students. So I'm seeing a more personalized approach. I think we also, as I look, all colleges are trying to become more global, but global is very expensive to travel. So I think there's some real great opportunities to give students international experiences and do it virtually by bringing. The other that I worry about.
What would that look like?
Well, an example might be, for example, this summer, there's a program, for example, that I'm familiar with, the Global Livingston Institute is putting on a program where students will go over and have they'll do it virtually, but they'll have panels with people in Uganda. They're actually going to do tours of downtown Kampala and walk them around just very much like a person would. They can have conversations with people, but they won't have the expense of flying across. The third item that I would say, and then I'll quiet down, that I worry about a little bit is my colleagues on trustees sometimes try to bring too much of their business background. So, you know, as we've had conversations, you know, they begin thinking about higher ed like they would think about their business. And yes, that's good, but I sometimes worry a little bit that boards will try to bring too much of their business background to higher ed.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need the business background when you're balancing the books, but you also have to realize you're not running a business, right? You're running a mission-driven, a lot of companies call themselves a mission-driven organization, but colleges actually are mission-driven organizations.
Yeah, if I could weigh in for just a moment on that, to extend on what David said, this is Craig Dunn. I'm at Western Washington University. So I live in Bellingham, Washington. You can see the yard out back. I live in a
Oh, nice, okay.
So I think that's a really good observation. I remember probably 25 years ago listening to the president of San Diego State University, who was, he was my employer at the time. He was at a philosophy club meeting, and he said the great benefactors of higher education historically had been the church, and then it became the government, and then it became business. And by the way, I say this as the former College of Business and Economics Dean at Western Washington University. And so I was wondering, how does that redefine learning and purpose for a university? The bottom line for me about higher education is, without an educated populace, you don't have a smoothly functioning democracy. Granted, we have to create workers or equip people to achieve their professional aspirations in the workplace. But there's something much more fundamental than that about higher ed. And to David's point, I don't think we should lose sight of that. That is just so foundational to the mission and purpose of higher education. We refer to ourselves as a proudly, publicly purposed university. That having been said, the majority of our financial support no longer comes from the state capital.
But you keep the mission.
We keep the mission.
I mean, it becomes one of the challenges that becomes much harder when this becomes a private good, or people start to see it as a private good. I've been watching that in the last couple of days as students start suing their institutions for, you know, their room and board money back. Well, that's understandable, but they're also suing their institutions a little bit more for, they're not getting quite the experience. They're not getting the experience they signed up for. I mean, I get that at one level, but on the other hand, this does kind of turn this, it does make it realize that so many more people are thinking about higher ed as a product rather than a service, or even a service, or as something, a commodity of some form that has a price, you know, that, you know, they can get their money's worth on.
Well, just one quick point about that, if I could, and that is that one thing I impress my students with every quarter at the beginning of the term is we are co-creating their educational experience. I don't create it for them and sell it to them as a product. I'm not providing a service to them. It's their experience, and that was one of the comments in chat I just saw. It's their experience that actually amplifies the other dimensions of education that are so important. And so it is a real co-creation activity.
How do we deal with the, I mean, other people feel free to weigh in too. The experience is going to obviously be changed, at least for the next, I mean, I'm going to say it's 6 months, maybe longer. We know how to create this residential experience. What does it look like when it's a little more distributed? I mean, I don't know if we're all going to want to be on Zoom calls 10 hours a day.
Yeah, so if I may, I'm Mike from University of Rochester. I'm a current junior here who's staying on campus over the whole period.
Nice.
And to follow up on the previous point, it's like really interesting how we more and more see colleges like a product, like you pay tuition and you really hope to get a job afterwards to repay the tuition. But in the end of the day, if we want to actually have the co-engagement and co-creation, then why don't we ask students about how they would want to see the college after COVID-19 and how they would want to see the fall semester and so on and so forth. Like there are a lot of restrictions that, for example, there are a lot of wishes that students would have, but will not be financially feasible and so on and so forth. But at least the gesture of let's bring all of us to the table, as opposed to having like a couple of deans and the president deciding on how the future of the college will be for the next few years.
All right, you're in charge for the next 5 minutes. What would you do?
I would say first step, just have a platform and conversation, whether it's like a 400-person Zoom call, which will go into like 20 breakout rooms, where we'll have a few questions about which the leadership is considering right now. For example, number one, are we inviting students back in the fall? Number two, either way, how are we conducting classes? Are they partially online or offline? Number three, what about all the co-curricular activities? What about the clubs that students enjoyed, but will probably not be able to function online, especially sports, let's say, if you're a big sports school. And let's say number four is, what are we doing with all the campus spaces and how we will be facilitating students on campus? Because, for example, we have rooms with capacity of like 200 students. CDC probably would not allow us to have like 200-person gatherings for the next semester. So what do we do? How do we break it? And then if we allow students to commit and to contribute to those ideas, even if it will be 20 people or 50 people, that will be at least some student input and not just a conversation between, oh, administration decides A and they tell students A, students disagree and they try to like petition administration to change and protest. Like, which way do we want to go? Yeah, that's my 5.
You did good, and it didn't take 5 minutes. We were talking about that in an earlier session today with some of the experts who talk a lot about sort of the importance of intergenerational collaboration. Now, of course, not every student is a different generation. Some of the students are the same age as their professors, but I think we can extend that notion of intergenerational collaboration to maybe just like more student university collaboration, especially in this time. There aren't many structures for that. There's shared governance, but student government is not usually generally regarded as sort of the, on the same par, but maybe there's a better role for student government. It was useful. When I've written a lot about innovative places in the past and talked to institutions, I said this earlier, I rarely hear about places that are systematically talking to their students, polling them, getting their input. A few places have social media programs or sort of like apps and things like that where they can kind of keep track of the mood a little bit, but I don't think that they generally have a really good policy on connecting well with students.
And if I may,
yeah, good.
Interrupt. Go ahead.
No, you.
Okay. If I may, like, it doesn't take like university leadership to decide to talk to all students. The same also applies to departments. Like I've heard different levels of engagement from different departments. For example, business department indeed had a Zoom call where we talked about, okay, what do we do next? Well, some departments basically like disappeared over the face of the earth, and I'm like, hi, I'm still here. Yeah. So like, it takes maybe, as some of you mentioned, like one professor talking to their students or one department leader. Yeah.
That's really good points here. Mike, you're getting a lot of kudos in the chat side, on the side of the chat here. So I'd say student participation, I mean, more connection to students, particularly right now, is a really important strategy going forward. Anybody else have another strategy going forward that they think we might want to just talk about for a minute or two as a tool for innovation?
So I'll weigh in. This is Carrie Weiss from the Martini Education and Opportunity Trust. And sort of building on what Mike just said so well, if you have prediction learning that's based on knowledge and data, we're given a certain set of historical facts, the students are taught to kind of predict what's going to happen. Then you have creation learning, and this is coming from some work that I read from Babson College. Creation learning where things are unpredictable, unknowable, things are happening that we could never have imagined were going to happen. I think this is the time to incorporate much more creation learning, but to the extent that faculty are not used to teaching that because that's not been the norm in academia. Then Mike's point about student participation, they're much more able to do that creation, perhaps, than the older generations. And so a participatory tone at an academic institution could allow us to tap their creation abilities and then drawing on professional inputs from faculty around how you organize creation learning. So the iteration, you throw something up, you see what works. If it doesn't work, you fail forward, you fail fast, you celebrate your failures. And I think this is a great time for universities to start to look at some of what that could offer, because you're really playing into the moment we're in and creating a style of learning that will fit this moment, perhaps. And the students could really help us lead the way with that.
Yeah, I completely agree, just because, like I said, everyone's, at least at this moment, everybody is like realizing that everything's changing and nobody quite knows how it's changing. So why not consider these other changes? I'm kind of coming back to this notion of shared governance, because I've actually haven't heard a lot about shared governance in this whole process. In the last month or so, I feel like, and understandably, I feel like a lot of university leaders over the past month made very difficult, challenging decisions to take the campuses, move them offline, get everything going. And by necessity, that probably didn't involve a lot of shared governance, and I'm not rebuking them for that, because I think lives were on the line, and probably more students are alive and faculty are alive because of it. But kind of wondering, like, what does shared governance now, now that everyone's stop and take a breath, and we sort of know what the end of this semester is going to look like, a mess, and we start to know what summer is going to look like, a mess, and fall, a mess. But maybe there's a way to sort of rethink about shared governance from the faculty side and from the student side a little bit more. I like this notion a lot.
I would just add to that staff get included in that as well.
Yeah, there's not really a function for that, is there?
Well, there isn't historically. When you say shared governance, people think faculty governance or faculty administrative governance,
Right.
Not so much students, not so much staff. I make a very deliberate distinction between shared governance and faculty governance, and include all the relevant stakeholders in this concept of shared governance. And I totally agree with you. In my limited experience here at Western, the whole process of shared governance was completely subverted by the crisis that was confronted. And there were communication breakdowns, and we're unionized faculty too.
Yeah, I'm not condemning it in any way. You may be, but I'm not. I'm just saying now that in a crisis, there's a role for strong leadership, especially if they can get things done. We'll just leave it there. But at some point, you have to kind of go back to some of these other principles, and maybe especially when we're out of the immediate crisis and we're into the next stage of this.
I wonder if it's maybe easier to go forward if you use the word shared leadership instead of shared governance.
Goldie, this is David. I would just, from my experience at the campus, we have, the president's put in place a all-campus task force that has faculty, staff, administration, and they have been tasked to develop for senior staff and our board of trustees 3 financial models, as we look at 20 and 21. One is, a best case scenario, one's a medium case scenario, and one is a worst case scenario. There's going to be a lot of tough decisions. Benefits are going to have to be taken away. Faculty teaching loads are going to have to be re-looked at. And there's going to have to be a spirit and engaging everybody in making these hard decisions. I think it's very helpful if the president has stood up right up in front and has made his own personal sacrifices going into that.
I think that's really useful. My alma mater, I got a note from our president saying similarly, he had created this committee. He wasn't as specific as you were about the, what's potentially on the line there, but I think you're exactly right. It's all on the line. Someone here's writing about governance. Case.
I think Frank just did a really great summary of the whole conversation at the bottom.
Oh, good job, Frank.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name is Laura Koza. I work at Georgian College under the Center for Changemaking and Social Innovation.
Mm-hmm.
I have a really exciting opportunity because I actually teach students social innovation in a field placement model. So I get them actually 16 hours a week, which is unique to other faculty who typically, like I teach other courses and have students for 3 hours a week. So it's a really big difference there. And I think what is so beautiful and what I really always love to capture about change making is the concept that we really get to educate the whole. It's not just, hey, we're going to talk about innovation. We're going to talk about economics. We're going to talk about impact. We really get to talk about the people. We get to fill their toolbox with all of these really beautiful soft skills, all of these really beautiful hard skills, everything from how to problem solve in an interview to how to respond with empathy to how to, and I think this concept of educating the whole is something that students always come back to us and say, this is the thing I didn't know I needed. Like that's the comment we get the most is most students typically don't necessarily want to sign up for a program. And everybody who does is blown away and always says, I didn't know I needed these toolkits. And we get comments from years after students saying, hey, this one thing I learned in CIP is coming through. So I think this, like, as I'm hearing about Mike speak, as I'm hearing about all of these beautiful contributors in this concept of this shared leadership, it's how do we embed the concept of the soft skills and educating the whole into the true nature of academia and higher education.
It's going to be a little more challenging. I think I definitely think you can do all that in a distributed remote teaching. I recently did a webinar for the Chronicle. We talked a little bit about even teaching, and using that diversity, teaching intercultural understanding in a remote environment. It's not like it can't be done, but it has to be a lot more intentional than it actually probably has to be intentional in a face-to-face environment too, but people take that a little bit more for granted. But I think when you're in a remote environment, you have to be a lot more intentional about a lot of these important values that you want to include in your educational process. And it's going to take a little, I think when everyone picks up their head and realizes what they just got done with in this semester, when they think about the next couple of semesters, they're going to be improving upon that a little bit, which will be good.
Yeah, it's the concept of values-based education. Where are we as educators putting our values, and how do we sort of communicate that in a way that bridges the gap to shared values to allow students to feel like they're part of their story?
Yeah.
I love it. It's so good. Thank you guys. You guys have all filled my cup today.
Hey, fill my cup too. I should have come up with a great closing question, but I didn't really. So I don't know if there's anyone else who has a question for me or a question for the group that they want to pose. We can go ahead and do that now. I think you've all given me a lot to think about between the session I had earlier today and this one that what I got from the speakers earlier today. Just thinking a little bit about. I don't think we came up with a curriculum on the right hand side there with the chat, or a sort of a new school of X. I mean, we have some notions about interdisciplinary and some other things. But I think we came up with some really interesting guiding principles to think about as colleges start to, I'm starting to read this stuff, I can't do both at once. As colleges start to sort of have to, engage with the next 6 months to a year, and then how much of that gets to stay behind, gets to linger on, will be very interesting to see, because there could be, through all the challenges that they're going to have to go through in the next year or so, there could be some things that come out of this that actually prove very educationally important and valuable. And I think that's, you know, I'm not one of these, oh, every crisis has a silver lining. I'm not that person. Every crisis is a freaking crisis, and they're bad, and people are sick and losing money and insecure and losing family members. There's nothing good about this crisis right now. But I think colleges can do a lot if they tap into the potential that they have around them. I mean, that's like the biggest strength of higher ed, right? It's a community of creative people and intelligent people and caring people, and in the best iteration of higher ed, at least. And that's really what we're counting on, I think.
Yeah. Goldie, this is Marina from Ashoka U. Maybe one way to connect some of the dots is a lot of the great ideas I'm seeing in the chat box. Some of them are more what, and we need to figure out the how. And some of them were almost more guideposts around the how, like the shared leadership. And then I think there's space to define a new what. And it's because I think I think within our current paradigm, we have a better sense of how would we rearrange the furniture on the ship we're on, versus I actually think part of the challenge is that we're trying to use our current logic from our existing institutional norms to think into the future, whereas actually in a whole new world where we can't meet in person, or in a whole new world where we can't do experiential learning, or we can't afford to do as much personalization as we might have wanted to do otherwise, then what? Then I'm almost going back to some of Carrie's points. I almost think if we have a values-based how and a general sense of the what, or at least the ideal what, I actually think the problem is our brains are not going to iterate a design to a new future. I actually think we're going to have to experiment and iterate our way experimentally with failures as well as learnings and successes. I almost think we're all going to have to learn new skills and new ways of being, because our current skill set is just not going to directly translate into the future. So I think part of it is being uncomfortable that it's a discovery process. It isn't like an analytical problem to solve that if we just think long enough, we'll figure it out. And that's where I think different people in the room and testing and trying and then getting feedback. It's almost like many of us are educators of innovation or social impact and, asset-based community development. We almost need to apply the same principles that we're educating students for to ourselves and our own communities and our own iteration and learning and process of starting with what are our institutional and community assets? How do we also reframe who our community is and how broadly we define it as the walls and boundaries are coming down? And then how do we collaboratively test and iterate? So
as long as we don't have to say as long as we don't have to iterate all the time.
I know. What I love, and this is maybe, even thinking I actually think what I love about entrepreneurship is that it actually is the scientific method and process in practice. So much of it is observation, testing hypotheses, seeing what works, basically documenting what doesn't, and then kind of adapting from there.
One of the college presidents, she was a former foundation official who I talked to when I did this report. She talked about how hard it is to fail, and that there, instead of all these conferences where everyone gets up and does all these brags about how great they are, that there ought to be more fail fests out there. And this environment might, I think the most popular piece on the Chronicle.com ever was this piece that ran a couple weeks ago about telling people to just take it easy, lower your expectations. You don't have to you're not gonna be perfect right now. Give yourself a break. And I feel like this period is gonna kind of create, we can't do it in healthcare. There's places where we can't give ourselves a break. But here, maybe colleges can, in a way. Maybe experiments that fail will be a little bit more tolerated now. Well, that's a good lesson for me. I'm gonna write that one down. Well, great. Well, I know a lot of us have had a long day. Somebody here was on 10 Zoom calls today, I said. So I just want to thank all of you. I'd love to continue to be in conversation with some of you to the degree that, I'm busy, you're all busy. I did this weekly newsletter called The Edge, which I think you've got to see a link to it somewhere. My email's in it every week. If you've got things responses to this conversation or to other things that you're reading in The Edge or elsewhere in the Chronicle, be in touch, and hopefully we'll meet sometime in real life and we can actually clink our glasses instead of just like waving them at the computer. Oh, right. Oh, and there's a note. Yes, the Chronicle is offered on this report and another one that I mentioned in an earlier session on career-ready education, or maybe I didn't mention it, but I should have. The Chronicle is offering a discount on these reports to people from Ashoka. So, you know, I wrote both of these reports were written in a different time, but I've gone back to reread both of them as I was preparing for this event today, and they're still very relevant. Everything about being all the demands of being a career ready, making students career ready a year ago are going to be all the more important now. Ditto on the techniques and examples for innovation. So I feel.
Can I actually ask a final question, Goldie? Just since we have you in the, you know, I don't know when we'll next get the chance. You know, it came up in one of our earlier sessions in the senior leaders experience of, especially now, there's more, like you mentioned, failure, but there's also a sense of, as a leader, can you be vulnerable? And if now isn't the perfect time to be vulnerable because no one actually has the answer, so of course everyone's vulnerable, it's just a matter of who's showing it. I'm curious, are you seeing that happening more? And is there more vulnerability in leadership? And I'm also curious, do students want strong leadership, or do they think there's strength in a vulnerable leader who's like, we may or may not have all the answers right now, but we'll figure it out and we'll iterate and adapt our way to it, you know? Curious.
I can't answer that definitively. Of course, everybody's a different, you know, there's a lot of people involved in this institution. The letter I got from my college president recently, I found it useful because he said what they were doing. He said what they knew. He said what they didn't yet know. You know, he said, we're still trying to figure this out. I felt like he was in command and also was very willing to sort of acknowledge that there are things there that he doesn't know and they're not quite sure how to proceed with yet. I mean, one of the things I said on a different Zoom call with a different group recently was, this is not the time to, you know, if you try to BS your way through this, you're going to, it's going to blow back at you. I don't think anybody should be trying to do that. I think it's good to have some answers. I mean, I don't think people will be tolerating, I don't know, week after week after week. But I think it's fair to come up to people and say, we know this much so far. I mean, one of the ways to deal with that is to just make plans, and, you know, you don't make a plan now for 6 months from now. You make a plan now for the next, you know, month or two, and then every month or every 3 weeks, you have to go back and revisit your plans. And, you know, the Chronicle was originally going to be remote for 2 weeks. Now it's 4 weeks. Then it was 6 weeks. Now we're remote till the end of May. I mean, that's just, you know, we're a small little organization. We're not as complicated as a college. But I think people, if you're adaptable and you communicate your adaptability and you can communicate, you know, I mean, if you do a lot of things that seem blatantly wrong and you're not consulting people properly and you're not proceeding, well, then you might get blamed. But, you know, this is a risky businesses. This is risky times. And I've also been kind of impressed by been a couple of college presidents, especially at the Cal State system, Tim White, and a couple of the other CSU individual presidents who've decided to stay on right now, stay longer. And I've been really fascinated. I think one of my colleagues is looking into this right now. The number of people who've recently been named presidents, can you imagine? Just, you know, and some of them presidents for the very first time, like taking this on right now. I mean, hats off, right? These are not the kind of jobs, these are not going to be sinecures. These are going to be really tough jobs. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate everybody's time. Those of you on the East Coast who've hung with it till the end of the day here. Those of you on the West Coast, go outside. You get sunlight, still good, do it. And thank you all very much.